There is a kind of tiredness that doesn't come from doing too much in a single day. It comes from carrying too much for too long. It's the tiredness of always being alert, always available, always ready to step in before things fall apart. You may not even notice it anymore. It has become part of how you breathe, how you listen, how you exist in the world. You wake up already thinking about what needs to be handled. Who might need you? What could go wrong if you don't pay attention? And even when nothing is happening, your body doesn't fully rest. There is a quiet tension underneath everything, a sense of responsibility that never completely turns off. If this feels familiar, you're not imagining it. And you're not weak for feeling it. You've simply been holding more than one person should hold alone. Somewhere along the way, responsibility stopped being something you do. It became something you are. You're the one people rely on. The one who remembers. The one who notices when something is off. The one who steps in before anyone asks. And on the outside, this looks like strength, competence, reliability. But on the inside, it often feels like pressure, like a quiet rule you never agreed to, but keep following anyway. If I don't do it, no one will. If I don't stay strong, everything will fall apart. If I rest, I'm letting someone down. These thoughts don't usually shout. They whisper. And because they whisper, they feel true. You may tell yourself that this is just who you are, that you're naturally responsible, naturally caring, naturally strong. But the truth is more complicated than that. This kind of responsibility is rarely a personality trait. It's usually a survival strategy. It forms quietly, often early in life, when you realize that your awareness matters, that your calm changes the room, that your presence stabilizes things. Maybe you noticed tension between adults before anyone spoke about it. Maybe you learned to read moods instead of words. Maybe you sensed that someone needed you to be okay, so they could function. So you adapted. You became attentive. You became reliable. You became the one who holds things together. Not because you wanted to, but because it felt safer than the alternative. And over time, being responsible started to feel like being loved. When you helped, you were appreciated. When you stayed strong, you were trusted. When you didn't need anything, you were admired. So needing less became a habit. Asking for help felt uncomfortable. Rest started to feel undeserved. You learned to carry without questioning the weight. And now, years later, that weight is still there. It shows up as exhaustion you can't fully explain, as a sense that you're always on, as a difficulty relaxing, even during moments that are supposed to be calm. You may feel guilty when you do nothing, restless when you're not productive, uneasy when you're not useful. And the hardest part is this: you don't know how to stop without feeling like you're failing, because responsibility has become tied to your sense of worth. If you stop carrying, who are you? If you don't step in, do you still matter? If you rest, will you be forgotten? These questions don't always come as thoughts. Sometimes they come as anxiety, as tension in the chest, as a constant background pressure that never quite leaves. You may even feel proud of how much you can handle, and at the same time, secretly resent how much is expected of you. This inner conflict is exhausting, because you're not just carrying responsibilities. You're carrying identities, expectations, unspoken contracts you never signed, and no one ever told you that you were allowed to put them down. If you're listening to this and feeling something tighten inside you, I want you to hear this clearly. There is nothing wrong with you. You didn't become this way because you're broken. You became this way because you adapted. And adaptations that kept you safe once don't disappear just because time passes. They stay in the body, in the nervous system, in the way you respond before you think. So if you feel responsible for everyone and everything, it doesn't mean you're controlling. It doesn't mean you're dramatic. It doesn't mean you're doing life wrong. It means you learned, very early, that holding things together mattered. And now, perhaps, you're starting to feel the cost of that lesson. This episode is not about blaming that part of you. It's about understanding it. Not to force change. Not to fix yourself. But to finally give language to a burden you've been carrying silently. You don't need to solve this today. You don't need to let go of everything at once. For now, it's enough to notice the weight, to acknowledge how long you've been holding it, and to allow yourself, even briefly, to rest in the idea that you don't have to carry everything alone. When responsibility becomes a constant state rather than a choice, it quietly shapes the way you move through the world. You don't experience it as pressure at first. You experience it as awareness, as care, as being someone who can handle things. And because it doesn't arrive as pain, you don't question it. You simply adjust your life around it. You think ahead. You anticipate problems before they appear. You prepare for situations that may never happen. Not because you enjoy worrying, but because being prepared feels safer than being surprised. There is comfort in control when unpredictability once felt overwhelming. And slowly, responsibility stops being something external. It moves inward. It becomes a lens through which you interpret everything. When someone is upset, you wonder what you did wrong. When something fails, you feel the urge to fix it. When someone struggles, you instinctively step closer instead of stepping back. This reflex doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from conditioning. Many people who carry emotional responsibility learned, early on, that stability depended on them in some way. Maybe you were praised for being mature for your age. Maybe you were the calm one when others were emotional. Maybe you learned that your needs could wait and eventually forgot they existed. What matters is not the specific story, but the emotional lesson that stayed with you. If I hold things together, everything will be okay. This belief doesn't fade easily. It becomes a background rule you live by without noticing. A rule that shapes your relationships, your work, your self-image. You may find yourself attracted to people who need support, to situations where you are the reliable one, to roles where responsibility is expected, even demanded. And when others don't take responsibility, you feel tension rise inside you. Not just frustration, but anxiety. Because when others drop the weight, it feels like it lands on you. You may even resent how often this happens, and then immediately feel guilty for that resentment. Because caring has become intertwined with self-sacrifice. And self-sacrifice, when it goes unexamined, slowly turns into self-erasure. One of the most subtle consequences of chronic responsibility is how it affects your inner world. You may notice that rest feels uncomfortable. That silence makes you uneasy. That doing nothing triggers a sense of urgency. Your mind looks for problems to solve, even when none are present. This is not because you enjoy stress. It's because your nervous system learned that vigilance equals safety. Relaxation, in contrast, can feel unfamiliar, even threatening. When responsibility has been your anchor, Letting go can feel like drifting without direction, and so you stay alert, even when you don't need to. Over time, this constant readiness creates fatigue that sleep alone cannot fix. You may feel tired even after resting, drained even after quiet days. Because the exhaustion is not physical, it's emotional. It comes from holding yourself together for too long. And perhaps the most painful part is that this effort often goes unseen. People see you as strong, capable, independent. They don't see the cost of that independence. They don't see how much it takes for you to stay composed, how often you swallow discomfort to avoid burdening others, how rarely you allow yourself to lean. And when no one notices, it reinforces the belief that you must keep carrying, alone. Because if you stop, who will step in? This question often lives beneath the surface, not as a clear thought, but as a constant tension. A fear that if you loosen your grip, everything will collapse. This fear doesn't mean collapse will actually happen. It means collapse once felt possible or real, and your system learned how to prevent it. Responsibility, in this sense, is not about controlling others. It's about preventing loss. Loss of stability, loss of connection, loss of safety. Understanding this changes how you relate to yourself. Instead of criticizing your inability to relax, you begin to see it as an old form of protection. Instead of judging your need to stay alert, you recognize it as a learned response. This doesn't mean you must keep living this way forever, but it does mean that change cannot come through force. You cannot shame yourself into rest. You cannot command yourself to stop caring. The part of you that carries responsibility is not an enemy. It is a protector. And protectors don't step aside just because they're told to. They step aside when they feel trust, when they feel safety, when they feel that the system no longer depends entirely on them. This is why simply telling yourself to let go rarely works. Letting go feels unsafe when responsibility has been the reason things survived. So instead of asking, "Why can't I relax?" a more honest question is, "What am I afraid will happen if I do?" Often, the answer is not dramatic. It's subtle. You're afraid of disappointing someone, afraid of being seen as selfish, afraid of no longer being needed. And beneath all of that, afraid of losing connection. Because if responsibility became your way of belonging, then releasing it feels like risking isolation. This is why emotional responsibility is so heavy. It's not just about tasks or obligations. It's about identity. Who you are has been shaped around being dependable, around being the one who holds space, around being the one who doesn't fall apart. So when exhaustion shows up, it creates confusion. You don't understand why you're tired. After all, you're doing what you've always done. But the truth is that carrying responsibility indefinitely was never sustainable. It worked when it had to, when there were no alternatives, when someone needed you to be that person. But you are not in survival anymore, even if your body hasn't realized it yet. And this gap, between where you are now and where you learned this pattern, is where the tension lives. You are allowed to notice that. You are allowed to question it. Not with judgment, but with curiosity. Because responsibility, when examined gently, can transform. It can shift from burden to choice, from obligation to boundary, from identity to one part of who you are, not the whole. That process doesn't start with dramatic change. It starts with awareness, with noticing when you step in automatically, when you take on what isn't yours, when you feel guilt for resting, not to stop yourself immediately, but to understand what part of you is acting and why. And that understanding is the beginning of something quieter, but far more sustainable. When emotional responsibility becomes a permanent position in your life, it doesn't stay confined to your thoughts. It begins to shape your relationships, your body, your sense of self. And often, it does so quietly. In relationships, you may notice that you are the one who listens more than you speak, the one who adjusts, the one who senses when something is wrong and tries to fix it before it grows. You may find yourself drawn to people who need support, not because you consciously seek imbalance, but because this dynamic feels familiar. Being needed feels like home. You offer stability, understanding, patience. And at first, this feels meaningful. It feels like connection. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. Your needs move to the background. Your emotions wait their turn. Your discomfort becomes something you manage alone, not because others demand it, but because you've learned that your role is to hold space, not to take it. You may even struggle to recognize when you need support. The signal has been muted for so long. And when you do feel overwhelmed, your instinct may be to withdraw rather than ask, because asking feels vulnerable. And vulnerability, when responsibility has been your armor, feels dangerous. This dynamic often creates a strange loneliness. You are surrounded by people, yet feel unseen, not because no one cares, but because no one sees how much you carry. And when no one acknowledges the weight, it reinforces the belief that this is simply your job. In the body, this pattern leaves traces as well. Chronic responsibility often lives as chronic tension. Tight shoulders, clenched jaw, shallow breathing. Your body stays prepared, even when there is no immediate threat. The nervous system remains in a low-grade state of alert, constantly scanning for what might need attention. This is why rest can feel unsatisfying. You lie down, but your system doesn't fully follow. Your mind may keep replaying conversations, anticipating future demands, rehearsing responses to problems that haven't happened yet. And because this tension is familiar, you may not even label it as stress. It just feels like normal. But over time, this constant activation takes a toll. Fatigue deepens. Focus becomes harder. Small tasks feel heavier than they should. And still, you keep going. Because stopping feels irresponsible. There is often a belief beneath this persistence. If I slow down, everything will fall apart, even when evidence suggests otherwise. You may notice that, when you finally do step back, even briefly, things don't collapse. Others adapt. Situations resolve themselves. And yet, relief doesn't immediately follow. Instead, guilt appears. A sense that you should be doing more, that you're letting someone down. That rest must be justified. This guilt is not a moral failing. It is a conditioned response. When responsibility has been linked to worth, rest feels like betrayal. This is why boundaries can feel so difficult. Saying no doesn't just feel like a choice. It feels like a statement about who you are. And the fear is not that others will be angry. It's that you will lose your place. Because when your role has been to hold everything together, stepping back feels like stepping out of connection. This fear often keeps people locked in cycles of overgiving. You give more than you have, then feel depleted, Then blame yourself for being tired, and the cycle continues. What often goes unnoticed is that responsibility in excess blurs the line between care and control. Not control in a manipulative sense, but in an emotional one. You feel responsible for outcomes that are not yours to manage, for feelings that are not yours to regulate, for problems that belong to others. And this creates pressure that no amount of effort can resolve, because you cannot carry what was never meant to be carried by one person. Over time, this pressure may show up as irritability, as numbness, as a quiet loss of joy, not because you don't care, but because your system is overwhelmed. There is a limit to how much emotional labor one person can sustain, and reaching that limit is not failure. It is information. It tells you that something in the system needs to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gently. This is where awareness becomes crucial. Noticing when you automatically take responsibility, when you step in before being asked, when you assume that something is yours to fix. Again, not to stop yourself immediately, but to observe, to ask quietly, is this actually mine? Often, the answer is no. But allowing that answer to exist takes practice, because responsibility has been your way of staying connected, of staying safe, of staying valuable. Releasing even a small part of it can feel like stepping into uncertainty. And yet, uncertainty is where growth begins. Not the kind of growth that demands transformation overnight, but the kind that invites space. Space for your own feelings. Space for rest without justification. Space to be supported instead of always supporting. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care without disappearing. It means you allow responsibility to be shared, rather than carried alone. And that shift, while subtle, changes everything. Because when responsibility is no longer the center of your identity, you begin to discover parts of yourself that were waiting quietly in the background. Parts that don't need to hold everything together to belong. At some point, usually after years of carrying emotional responsibility, a quiet question begins to surface. Not loudly, not clearly. It shows up as discomfort, as hesitation, as a strange resistance to slowing down. The question is simple, but heavy. What happens if I stop? This question is rarely about practical consequences. It's not really about tasks being undone or problems going unsolved. It's about something deeper. It's about identity. When responsibility has shaped who you are for so long, letting go doesn't feel like relief. It feels like erasing yourself. Because responsibility didn't just organize your actions. It organized your place in the world. You became the reliable one, the strong one, the one who doesn't fall apart. And that role gave you something important, a sense of belonging. So when you imagine stepping back, even slightly, your system reacts as if something essential is at risk. This is why guilt appears so quickly. Guilt for resting. Guilt for saying no. Guilt for not anticipating what others might need. This guilt is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It is a sign that responsibility has been tied to love. Somewhere along the way, the message became internalized. If I am responsible, I am valuable. If I am needed, I belong. If I carry this, I am safe. So when you stop carrying, even briefly, your system interprets it as danger. Not logical danger. Emotional danger. The danger of being replaced. of being forgotten, of being seen as selfish or unreliable. These fears don't always come with words. Often, they come with sensations. A tight chest, a restless mind, an urge to just check in or just make sure. And because these sensations are uncomfortable, you return to what feels familiar. You pick the responsibility back up. Over time, this creates a loop. You feel exhausted. You consider resting. Guilt arises. You resume carrying. And the cycle continues. What makes this loop particularly difficult to break is that it once served a real purpose. There was a time when your responsibility truly mattered, when your presence stabilized something fragile, when your strength compensated for a lack of safety elsewhere. In that context, carrying was not optional. It was necessary. So your system learned that staying alert was not just helpful. It was essential. The problem is that systems don't update themselves automatically. Your life may have changed. Your circumstances may be different. But your nervous system is still operating on old information. It still believes that everything depends on you. This is why logic alone cannot undo this pattern. You can tell yourself that you're allowed to rest. You can remind yourself that others are capable. And still, your body resists. Because the fear is not rational. It is relational. It is about what responsibility once meant in terms of connection and safety. This is where compassion becomes crucial. Not the kind of compassion that excuses endless self-sacrifice, but the kind that understands why letting go feels so hard. Instead of asking, "Why can't I stop?" a more honest question might be, "What did stopping once cost me?" Often, the answer is subtle. Maybe stopping meant being ignored. Maybe it meant conflict. Maybe it meant emotional distance. Or maybe it simply meant feeling alone. So your system decided, this is not worth the risk. And it held on to responsibility as a way to stay connected. Understanding this changes the tone of the work. Letting go is no longer about forcing yourself to do less. It's about building enough internal safety to risk doing less. And safety doesn't come from pressure. It comes from trust. Trust that you won't disappear if you stop holding everything together. Trust that your worth is not dependent on exhaustion. Trust that connection can exist without constant effort. This trust cannot be rushed. It is built slowly, through small experiences. Moments where you don't step in, and nothing terrible happens. Moments where you rest, and are still valued. Moments where you say no, and remain connected. At first, these moments may feel uncomfortable. You may feel anxious afterward. You may replay the interaction. You may wonder if you did the wrong thing. This doesn't mean you failed. It means you're retraining a system that learned responsibility as survival. And retraining takes patience. Another layer of fear often appears here. If I stop being the responsible one, who will I be? This question can feel destabilizing. Because when identity has been built around holding things together, there may not be a clear sense of self underneath. You know how to show up for others. You know how to manage crises. But you may not know how to exist without a role. This uncertainty can feel like emptiness. And emptiness, when unfamiliar, feels frightening. But this space is not absence. It is potential. It is the space where parts of you that were never allowed to rest can finally breathe. The part of you that doesn't need to anticipate. The part that doesn't need to fix. The part that doesn't need to prove worth through effort. These parts have always been there. They were simply overshadowed by responsibility. Letting go, then, is not about losing yourself. It is about meeting yourself beyond the role you learned to play. This is a gradual process. Some days, you will carry less. Other days, you will pick the weight back up. This does not mean you're going backward. It means you're human. The goal is not to eliminate responsibility. It is to allow it to be chosen rather than automatic. To respond instead of react. To care without disappearing. And most importantly, to recognize that your value was never meant to be measured by how much you endure. You are allowed to exist without holding everything together. And learning that is not selfish. It is healing. If you have been listening to this and feeling seen, even quietly, I want to say something clearly. There is nothing wrong with you. You are not weak for feeling tired. You are not broken for wanting rest. You are not failing because the weight feels heavier than it used to. You carried what needed to be carried when it mattered most. And that matters. The part of you that learned to be responsible did so to protect something important, to keep connection, to maintain stability, to survive moments when letting go did not feel safe. That part deserves respect. But respect does not mean permanence. You are allowed to grow beyond what once kept you safe. You are allowed to recognize that what was necessary then may be limiting now. This does not require dramatic change. It does not require confrontation. It does not require you to abandon who you are. It begins with awareness. With noticing when responsibility arises automatically, with pausing, even briefly, before stepping in, with allowing yourself to ask, is this truly mine to carry? Sometimes the answer will still be yes, and that's okay. Other times, the answer will be no, and learning to tolerate that answer is part of the healing. You may notice discomfort when you don't intervene, a sense of unease when you rest, a lingering guilt when you choose yourself. These sensations do not mean you made the wrong choice. They mean you are stepping outside a pattern that once defined your safety. Change often feels unsafe before it feels freeing. This is why gentleness matters. You don't heal this pattern by pushing yourself harder. You heal it by listening more closely. Listening to your body when it tightens. Listening to your mind when it insists. Listening to the younger part of you that learned responsibility as love. And then, slowly, showing that part something new. That you can be present without carrying everything. That you can be connected without being exhausted. That you can be valuable without being indispensable. Rest does not erase your worth. Boundaries do not make you selfish. Letting others carry their own weight does not mean you care less. It means you are learning to care differently. And differently does not mean worse. It means more sustainable. You may not know yet who you are without constant responsibility. That's okay. You don't need a new identity right now. You only need space. Space to breathe without monitoring. Space to exist without fixing. Space to be held, even imperfectly. This space may feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable. But unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It means new. And new is where growth begins. If today all you can do is notice the weight, that is enough. If all you can do is question a reflex, that is enough. If all you can do is rest for a moment without justification, that is more than enough. You have spent a long time holding everything together. You are allowed, now and then, to let yourself be held. And you don't have to carry this alone anymore.